the overview of what we are going to talk about this evening, a bit of background essentially at the start, and then the core of the presentation this evening will be around 3 areas of concentrate supplementation. So essentially looking at flat rate versus feed to yield strategies, and then within the feed to yield strategy, breaking down the 2 main components of it, looking at the appropriate concentrate feed rates in terms of how much concentrate to feed per litre of milk, and also then the important aspect of how much milk is actually being provided from the grazed grass itself, so that you know at what level of yield to start feeding the concentrates, and finish up then with a basic summary. So just before I start getting into the details, just to again highlight that the research being highlighted this evening was co-funded by Ag-Research and the Department of Agriculture for Rural Development in Northern Ireland, and just to acknowledge the assistance of the colleagues in the dairy unit here at Hillsborough in pulling together the various bits of information. So just to start in terms of the background, volatility of prices is a term that's used quite a lot in the dairy industry, and certainly in the last 12 months we have seen the very extremes of the highs and lows that's possible within milk price in particular. But essentially, once you drill into the detail of that, a lot of the main factors that influence that volatility are outside of the control of the individual farmer, and much more in control of the farmers that he can have an influence on are the things within the farm gate, and particularly in terms of looking at the costs of production. And if you're going to look at reducing the cost of milk production, no better place to start to look than actually looking at the biggest costs involved, and essentially concentrates, particularly from a Northern Ireland point of view, represent about 60 to 70% of the variable costs of producing a litre of milk. So it's quite clear then that there's a need to optimise the use of these expensive concentrates within dairy cow diets. And in terms of farms, whether you're high, medium or low milk output, there is a lot of room for sort of looking at the amount of concentrates that are used to produce a certain amount of volume of milk. And the graph illustrates that point. The dots represent individual farm data that's been collected within Northern Ireland. And essentially concentrate input is along the bottom, annual milk output on the vertical axis, and you can see there the red bars basically represent about a tonne of concentrates, and you can see that from the highest and lowest concentrate input to produce the same amount of milk output, there is a large variation there at every level. So there is an opportunity here to look at how to improve the use of concentrates on farm. And the topic tonight is really focusing on the grazed grass element, or the summer portion of the annual production cycle. And grazed grass has become an underutilised resource, particularly in Northern Ireland, but equally applicable across the UK, wider UK and also Europe. And particularly within Northern Ireland and the mainland UK, herd sizes have increased quite significantly in recent years, not really being constrained with milk quotas just as heavily as some of our other European neighbours. The downside to that has been grazing platforms generally have not increased in size to keep pace with increasing herd sizes. So essentially farmers have found themselves with having inadequate amount of land that is within walking distance of the parlour to be fit to graze their herd. On top of that, then you have poor grazing conditions, and that can happen at any point during a grazing season. Case in point being almost the last 2 to 3 weeks, particularly in Northern Ireland here. That results in poor animal performance, which again just erodes confidence in grazed grass as a feed for the modern milking cow. And on top of all that, you've got a very specific nutritional challenge that is being presented by the modern high-yielding Holstein Friesian cow. And really with that type of animal, there is a perception that in order to meet her requirements in terms of from a nutrition point of view, there's a need to keep her inside, either buffer feed her during milking, buffer feed her overnight, or taking it to the next level and basically keeping her inside on a total confinement system. And really the graph on this slide represents that challenge quite clearly, in that milk yield is up the vertical axis months of the year across the bottom. And you can clearly see there the solid black diagonal line, the yield potential of a typical high yielding cow going out to grass in March, maybe doing 40 litres a day, still doing 25 litres a day in late grazing season in September. And really the dotted line on that graph represents the potential of grass. So clearly the yellow section is a nutritional challenge, how best to fill that gap between what can be supported from grass on its own and the requirements of the cow. And that's the challenge presented by the cow. The grass actually presents many other challenges from the grass supply point of view. Ideally, you would like to be able to present your grazing cow with a constant supply of a constant quality of grass. And as we all know, grass has variations in growth during the season and indeed between months, between years. And 2015 has been no different. A project that I'm involved in here, which monitors grass growth across Northern Ireland, you can clearly see there the dotted dashed line is the long-term average, and clearly we're only in mid-May and we've had periods of significantly higher than average growth and periods currently of below average growth. And essentially what that means is that cows can be presented then with what is too much grass at various times of the season, and equally inadequate covers of grass then at other times. And all that does is really increases the challenge of feeding that cow. So, apologies. So in terms of the three aspects of concentrate supplementation that we're going to cover this evening, I want to first look at basically a comparison of flat rate feeding versus feed to yield. So essentially, flat rate feeding is where you basically allocate concentrates at a constant rate across a large number of cows in the herd. Feed to yield is much more on an individual cow basis. So cows individually are fed based on their individual milk yield. And the wee bit just about the study, basically we compared the flat rate and feed to yield system, 28 cows on the two treatments, including cows and heifers. These animals were mid-lactation whenever they were on the study, and concentrates were offered at 0.6 kilos per litre of milk above the potential of grass. And just a wee bit about the concentrates rates that were used. There's only really a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to in this table. Essentially, first, we've got the flat rate treatment on this side, feed to yield on the right side. Cows and heifers were allocated concentrates separately or individually. And essentially, if you just take May, for example, on average, or all the cows on the flat rate treatment received 5.5 kilos of concentrates, as opposed to cows in the feed to yield were getting anything from 1 kilo to 10 kilos. All concentrates were fed through the parlour, so concentrates were capped at 10 for cows, 8 for heifers. Minimum per day was 1 kilo for cows and heifers. But ultimately the most important figures in this table are the ones along the bottom in blue, and essentially cows on the two treatments and heifers on the two treatments received the same amount of meal on average over the study. And essentially that's a key difference from other studies where a true feed to yield, you basically follow the yield, whereas we were balancing the concentrate inputs across both. And essentially, this is a table of the main production data from the study. And as you look down the various rows through milk yield, milk composition, milk solids and energy output, and obviously live weight and body condition score of cows at the end of the study, there was no difference in any of those parameters between concentrates being fed on a flat rate or a feed to yield basis. Bearing in mind the previous table where there was quite a significant difference in how the concentrates were being offered. So in terms of some conclusions from that aspect of management, concentrate allocation had no effect on overall performance, but just to qualify that, the study was based on mid and late lactating cows. So essentially, we're hypothesizing here, but essentially there is potential for greater treatment effect could be expected if repeated with animals of a wider range of calving dates and milk yields. And that's important to remember. If you're taking this onto a farm situation where cows range from 5 days in milk to 405, potentially you would have a massive difference between allocating concentrates on a flat rate or a feed to yield basis. The animals in this study were in mid to late lactation only. The second aspect then that I want to talk through is concentrate supplementation rate. And essentially this is how much concentrates to feed per litre of milk. And essentially if you go back 5-10 years, this would have been quite difficult to do, but modern milk imparters almost do this automatically now with milk recorders, automatic cow ID, etc., etc. So it's quite critical then that if farmers have access to this modern technology, that the computer is set up properly to be able to feed the cows the correct quantity of concentrates. And the response to concentrates within a feed to yield type system is driven by the feed rate and also then the milk from grass above which you start feeding the concentrates. And we'll deal with the milk from grass one next. But essentially the concentrate feed rate in a feed to yield system, 0.45 kilos of concentrate per litre is a figure that is quite often used within the industry. And essentially that's based on 5.1 or around 5 megajoules of energy required to produce a litre of milk. And typically a kilo of concentrate containing 11.5 or 12 megajoules of energy. So you divide one into the other and you quickly realize that you need about 0.45 kilos of concentrate to support a litre of milk. The complication in this is that actually whenever you feed concentrates to the grazing cow, there is an element of substitution in that you feed the cow more concentrates, you actually could knock out the amount of grass that she has eaten. And essentially then the net energy intake increase from a kilo of concentrates isn't potentially 11. It could be much less than that depending on how much intake of grass is impacted on. And if you look at the literature and apply some reported substitution rates, you can actually establish that a figure closer to 0.6 may well be more appropriate for a feed rate. So we wanted to examine this within a grazing situation. We had a larger number of cows, 138 cows, 46 per treatment. Again, these animals were approaching sort of mid-lactation by the time they were going on to the study in the end of April. And we looked at 3 different concentrate feed rates. We had 0.25, 0.45 and 0.65 kilograms of concentrate per litre of milk. So I've got quite a big table here, quite a lot of figures, but again, I just want to draw your attention to various elements of it. The column on the extreme left basically just highlights the various dates at which meal levels were adjusted. So in general, we were adjusting concentrate feed levels on a fortnightly basis. Basically, that allowed us to take account of most likely a reducing milk coming from grass, but also then a reducing milk yield of the cows. The other thing to notice is that again, the heifers, these 4 columns, and the cows, the 4 columns on the right, were allocated concentrates separately from each other with their own milk production potential of grass there highlighted as the 2 red columns. And again, if you're just casting your eye down the red columns there for the cow point of view, you will notice that we were assuming sort of around 21, 23 litres of milk in early June, down to about 12 in September. Again, this study was conducted in 2012, which, as many of you will know, was quite a difficult year for managing grazing animals, and essentially that had a detrimental effect on how much milk we could actually get from grass, and that subsequently had an impact then on the concentrate feed rates that we were using. But essentially, in summary, you can see the average concentrate input if you look across the bottom, the second from bottom row, and also then total concentrate input. So essentially, as you would expect, the higher concentrate feed rate, the more concentrate on average was being allocated per cow per day. And just this table just summarizes some of the animal performance effects. The top line there is the total milk output. So essentially, if we just look down the 0.25 kilogram of concentrate column compared to the 0.45, you will notice that milk yield on total and on a daily basis increased as concentrate feed rate increased from 0.25 to 0.45. The other thing to note then is that as you go from 0.45 to 0.65, there was no further increase in milk yield, either total or on a daily basis. In terms of average concentrate intake, it's the bottom figure within the circle. You can see that, as you've seen from the previous table, concentrate intake did increase as you went from 0.25 to 0.45, and increased again as you went from 0.45 to 0.65. And essentially that has an important impact on the response achieved to concentrates, because essentially you were feeding approximately 1.5 kilo more meal as you made each jump, but essentially you did not get a response as you went from 0.45 to 0.65. And that's quantified there in the grey bars. You can see almost 2 kilos of milk per kilo of concentrate as you went from 0.25 to 0.45, and less than half a kilo of milk per kilo of concentrate as you went from 0.45 to 0.65. And if you bear in mind that milk at 23, 24, 22 pence at the minute concentrates to 20 to 30 pound a tonne, which is 22, 23 pence a kilo, you're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio required just to break even. So clearly the concentrate feed rate of 0.65 was not producing an economic response to the concentrates being fed. Again, you can see the non-significant effect on milk composition, non-significant effect on live weight, body condition scores, very minimal effects coming through there as well. The interesting thing in this study was really drilling into what the actual composition of the diet was. And within this study, we had an intensive period of measurement in July, where we measured the grass intake via allocation technique. And essentially, if you just look at the concentrate intake column in this table, again, reflecting, mirroring the data we've seen earlier, obviously concentrate intake increased as you went from 0.25 to 0.45. If we move across then and look at the grass intake between 0.25 and 0.45, the values are in fact similar. And you add those two together, what you actually get is a positive effect on the total intake of the animals, and that then is being reflected in a positive effect on the milk yield of the cows in the 0.45 treatment compared to 0.25. And then if we just go on to look at what actually was happening within the 0.65 treatment, again we'll compare it to 0.45, you will see that concentrate intake did increase. And actually what happened is that we reduced the grass intake from 12.3 to 10.9. And what that did then, whenever you add the concentrate and the grass together, it had no benefit in terms of total intake, and then unsurprisingly, no benefit in terms of total milk yield. So essentially what we were doing here is we were replacing cheap grass with expensive concentrates, really showing the extremes of the substitution effect that we discussed earlier and the dramatic effect that can have on response to concentrates within a grazing system if an inappropriate concentrate feed level is actually adopted. So in terms of putting some economics onto this, unsurprisingly, you will notice in the middle column here, 0.45 produces the highest margin over concentrates. And then if you also bring in an estimate of forage costs for the proportion of the year that these cows was grazing, again, the 0.45 produces the highest margin. And again, there's some assumptions in here, 24 pence a litre for milk, concentrates at 220. Again, that we did do some sensitivity analysis in this, moving those values up and down, and the ratio of the treatments remains pretty robust, and that the 0.45 does have an advantage over the other two. So in terms of conclusions, milk yield increased when the concentrate feed rate increased from 0.25 to 0.45. Increase in concentrate feed rate further did not result in a further increase in yield, and a feed rate of 0.45 was most robust across a range of milk prices and concentrate costs. So I just want to go into the final area that I want to talk through tonight, which is what milk yield can grazed grass support when supplemented with concentrates. And the graph here basically illustrates the three treatments that we imposed, from a high milk from grass to a medium in the blue line and a low milk from grass being the green line. So the red line essentially went from 25 litres of milk in May down till 14 litres of milk in sort of late September, early October. The blue line, the medium, then was reduced by 15%. The green line then was reduced by 30% from high to low. This was for the cows. The heifers, then a further reduction of 20% was applied just to allow for the lower intake of the heifers. And just straight into some of the results from the study. As you would expect, if you assume that grass is supporting a lower level of milk, you will then have to feed an increased level of concentrate. And you can see there, as you move across the top row, as you go from high milk from grass to medium, there's an increase in concentrate intake, and to low, a further increase. That, in this case, was also mirrored in a step increase in milk yield as you went from high to medium to low. Whenever you applied it onto a milk solids perspective, actually there wasn't a benefit as you went from medium to low due to some small differences in milk composition. Not significant, but whenever they were multiplied up, then it had resulted in a non-significant difference in fat plus protein yield. The one thing we did find is that the animals on the low milk from grass actually ended up heavier and also in better condition. I say better condition, statistically it was better, but if you cast your eye across the means there, you'll see there's a difference of about 0.1, 0.15. So practically there's not a big difference there, but statistically there was a benefit or higher condition for the cows on the low treatment. Again, if we were going to put some economics, the same criteria as we had before, you will see as you go from the high to the medium, there is a big increase in margin, and then only a very small further increase as you went to the low milk from grass. So again, just to conclude, adopting high milk from grass values, i.e. assuming an increased reliance on grazed grass, did result in less concentrates being fed, but also then resulted in lower milk output and ultimately thinner cows. Therefore, it's likely that these high values were being overly optimistic for the type of animal that we had, and adopting the medium milk from grass seems to be more appropriate when weather and grazing conditions are good. However, again, we want to just qualify that in periods of difficult grazing conditions, it may well be necessary to adjust these on a short-term basis just to allow for potential impacts of poor grazing conditions, poor intakes, etc. So I've just got a few more slides here just to put the subject into context. Again, grass is and has been and will continue to be critically important, particularly within Northern Ireland agriculture, and that applies probably even to UK and even in wider Europe. The one caveat is here that we must manage it effectively to ensure it can be grown and utilised efficiently. Grass is a cheap feed provided you grow it and utilise it well. If you don't do either of those two things, you lose a lot of the benefit of the cost benefit. In terms of supplementation, appropriate supplementation to the correct animals at the correct rate is something that we should all be striving to do. And essentially, concentrates need to be used as a supplement and not a substitute for grass. Certainly, we have demonstrated in these studies that supplementing grass can provide, can provide an economic response, but once you start over supplementing with concentrates and basically replacing cheap grass with expensive concentrates or wasting grass, then the economics just become much less viable. And again, we're all acutely aware of the current and potentially medium-term outlook for dairy markets, and essentially 2015 is potentially the year for a renewed focus on grass. And I just want to leave you with a few thoughts on focusing on grass. And I feel there's 5 main areas here that if a farmer was really keen to improve production from forage, looking at these 5 areas could really be of big benefit. Good infrastructure is the first one. Essentially, large, irregularly sized fields that are poorly serviced with water and access points are a major limitation to improving the use of forage, even particularly in terms of grazed grass. I am aware that an investment is required, particularly if you're starting from scratch, but you get a period of weather like the last 2 to 3 weeks, and that sort of an investment becomes almost invaluable to be able to keep the herd grazing and keep your grass in the diet of the cow. Realistic targets is the second thing, and again, farmers should be aware of what targets they need to be thinking about from a grass point of view, whether that be pre and post grazing targets, stock and rates, simple things even like herd demand, rotation lengths. Once a farmer understands what these figures should be, then he can very quickly benchmark where he is and potentially where he should be. Assessing swards regularly. It's a big one that we all keep trying to encourage more and more people to get involved in. And essentially, there is no shortcuts in trying to manage grass better. You basically have to get out there, get into the fields on a regular basis. And I fully recognize it involves an investment in time, but essentially there is many ways where this investment will repay you. I'm not going to go through all the various aspects here, but essentially a small investment in time can reap massive rewards. Particularly in recent years, we've seen developments of web and app-based software, which can actually take a lot of the number crunching out of the process. There's getting less and less excuses for why more and more farmers can't get involved in monitoring the performance of their swards. I have silage on my list. Essentially, a lot of farmers feel once you start talking about improving performance from grass, essentially you're in the realms of the grazing situation. But the reality is, particularly in Northern Ireland, conserved forages and predominantly grazed grass, or predominantly grass silage, makes up a large proportion of the diet of the cow for 5-6 months of the year. So improvements in silage quality can have a dramatic effect on the annual performance of a farm business. And the figures there just illustrate that more and more we've seen a trend for farmers to go to a 2-cut system in an attempt to try and reduce contractor charges. But essentially, farmers need to consider the true cost of that lower quality feed over a 5-6 month winter period. And the topic tonight has been on optimising the use of concentrates, and there you can clearly see 4 kilos more concentrates required to produce similar milk yield between a low quality and a high quality silage. You can do the maths, but 4 kilos a day per cow per day over the winter period, over 150 cow herd, the numbers get big very, very quick. And just to finish, soil, there has been whole webinars dedicated to talking about aspects of the soil, so I don't intend to revisit them all at this stage. Suffice to say that efforts that are put in by a farmer to manage everything above the soil surface can be undermined if what's going on below the soil is not also kept in check, and targets are not met in that regard. So essentially, thank you for listening, and thank you again for Dairy Co for the opportunity to present the research through this webinar tonight. I just want to finish by drawing your attention to the fact that everything that I've been talking about is summarised in a farmer's booklet, which is available to download from the AgriSearch website. And whenever you're on the website, there's lots of other aspects of dairy, beef and sheep research there that is again available to download.